Welcome to another episode of Discovering the Jewish Roots. I'm Dr. Rik Wadge, and we're continuing our study in the Gospel of Matthew. You can pick up the full commentary that I've put together based upon first century rabbinic tradition as well as the Aramaic text, which is called the Peshitta text. It is considered to be the easy, the simple text. In other words, it's the one that is straightforward. It has not been translated. It's straight from the roots of the mouths of Yeshua and of the apostles themselves, the first disciples, the Talmudim. So when we're looking at discovering the Jewish roots, and specifically of the Gospel of Matthew, and I talk about picking up my book, the commentary on Discovering the Jewish Roots of the Gospel of Matthew. You can pick that up on Amazon.com, and there'll be a commercial that runs about the middle of this episode. So if you haven't seen that and you want to pick it up and learn more about the Aramaic text, I just suggest you do so. You know, most of the thoughts within the commentary that I put together are based upon wiser men and women throughout the years that have studied the Jewish culture. They've studied the Second Temple period to such a exact science that it really makes sense to go back to that kind of study and looking at the culture in that way, because it's going to open up our eyes to what was really meant, what was said, what was taught, and then how we can apply that to our own lives. So we're going to continue in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be looking at then verse 34 in the Gospel of Matthew, and it says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry for itself. It is sufficient for trouble to come at its time." Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. In the modern book, the Book of Yiddish, The Joys of Yiddish by Leo Rolston, we find a very typical Jewish saying that goes like this. It says that don't worry about tomorrow, because who knows what disaster may come upon you today. Now, this is obviously an instance where an ancient rabbinic saying has resurfaced again in a modern book. And that's true. Now, Yeshua, in this verse that we just looked at in chapter 6, verse 34, may also be quoting from a very well-known saying during his day. And you know, this is one of the things I've been trying to communicate throughout this series, is that Yeshua, Jesus, was not coming up with something original in most of his sayings. He was looking at what they already knew and breathing into it the authority that comes alone from the Messiah. And so with that having been said, they never said, wow, he's bringing a brand new teaching. They said he speaks as one with authority, and that absolutely is the case. When we look at some of the rabbinic writings, when we look at the prophets, when we look at the sayings, the writings, the poetic words of King David, we know who inspired the biblical text. It was God. And so for us to think for a moment that God wasn't still inspiring the people that were completely devoted to him is just foolishness. Of course he was. So when Yeshua is quoting sources from the rabbinic sayings of the day, he's saying, I agree with these things, and because of who he is as Messiah, we know that he's the one who breathed the inspiration behind those original words that he is now repeating and saying, this is true, you've heard this before, I'm saying to you, put this in your life, practice this in your life. So he's very Jewish, he's a first century Jewish rabbi, but he's also Messiah, breathing authority into the words of what was known. They just needed to practice those. And I think it's so important. So here's another quote that comes along with this not worrying about tomorrow. This comes to us from the Sanhedrin text in the Babylonian Talmud. It says, "Do not distress yourself with tomorrow's affliction, for you don't know what a day may bring forth. Perhaps tomorrow may not even be, and you will be found stressing yourself over nothing." That's exactly what Rabbi Yeshua, Jesus, was saying. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 1, says this, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged." Now, when Rav Shaul, we know him as the Rabbi Paul or the Apostle Paul, he reflects upon these words of Yeshua, because now he's switching from Gamaliel to looking at Yeshua as being his rabbi and his Messiah and the source. He says this to the Roman congregation. He says in Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 1, he says, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things." You see, the Pharisees of the day reflect the very same opinion as well. Rabbi Hillel, who was well beloved and well respected, said, "Do not judge your fellow until you have been in his place." And that's recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, the Sayings of the Fathers, Avot 2:14. Here's another place in Avot, the Sayings of the Fathers, chapter 4, verse 10. It says, "Do not be a judge of others, for there is no judge but the one." In other words, of God. God is the one. Well, Yeshua continues in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 2. He says, "For with the judgment that you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure that you use to measure, it will be measured to you." We find the very same sayings and sentiment within the traditions of the rabbis. This is from Shabbat 127b. "He who judges his neighbor in the scale of merit will himself be judged in that scale of merit." Or as another translation has placed this text in Shabbat 127, it says, "How you judge others, does God judge you?" In the section called Kiddushim, we find the very insightful thoughts about this same idea. And it's in Kiddushim 70a. It says, "He who condemns others sees in them his own faults." Wow. Pause. Think about this. What we see in others is because of the faults we see within ourselves. Friends, let's think about that for a minute. Is that the point of all this? Is that we're avoiding the things about ourselves and just coming clean before God in recognition that, God, you're perfect and we're not. We make mistakes every day. I need to come before you, as David says over and over again, King David. I need to come before you and confess before you with a contrite heart that I am not holy in and of myself, in and of my own desires and my own thoughts and my own actions at times. I need you to purify me, you to be the lamb that's slain for me and my household. And this is the guts of this thing, that as we study, we're not just studying for the sake of gaining more knowledge and understanding more of Yeshua, what he said, but if we're not taking Yeshua's words to heart as our rabbi, and we're putting that into our lives so that we become changed and different and have a clearer, more true understanding of who we are in the scheme of things before God, then friends, we have missed the whole purpose of all this. Now, Rabbi Shaul says this in Romans chapter 2, verse 19 through 23. He says, "And if you have persuaded yourself that you are a guide to the blind, a light in the darkness, an instructor for the spiritually unaware, and a teacher of children, since in the Torah you have the embodiment of knowledge and truth," pause for just a minute. In the Torah, you have the embodiment of knowledge and truth. It contains what is true and what we need to learn for our lives. Let's continue on in verse 21. Then you who teach others, don't you teach yourself? In other words, take off the blinders. When we're coming face to face with knowledge and truth, if we don't apply it in our own lives and hold up the mirror of the Torah in front of us and say, this is who it says I am, and I'm going to be honest, this is who in fact I am and who I need to become, then we have missed it. And then he goes on to say, don't you teach yourself? And he says, preaching, thou shalt not steal, do you steal? Verse 22, saying, thou shalt not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? Detesting idols, do you commit idolatrous acts? Verse 23, you take such pride in Torah, do you by disobeying the Torah dishonor God? Friends, when we disobey the Torah, God's instruction manual, it's not just about laws, it's instructions for life. When we disobey God's instructions, are we dishonoring God? And the answer is very clearly, yes, it is. To think that we could live in a universe where there's no rules is pretending that mathematics are not real, that the rules of the universe don't exist, that the laws of thermodynamics are not real. There are rules. 2 + 2 = 4. There are rules. An apple drops from a tree, it's going to hit the ground. There are rules in this universe. There are rules in this life. And there are moral rules, ethical rules for how we live. And there are consequences when we say 2 + 2 = 5. We get it wrong. In the same way, we get life wrong when we disobey God's instructions. We get it wrong. And we don't understand the truth, and we're not holding up the mirror of truth before us so that we can compare how we think, how we see life, and how we live to what God says the standard should be. I know I'm getting a little preachy, but the point is that there are standards. Yeshua continues in Matthew chapter 7, verse 3. Why is it that you see the speck in the eye of your brother, but the log that is in your eye you do not notice? It is so easy, friends, for us to point out others' faults. In fact, I was reading a book the other day, and it pointed out that most of the time, if not, I was about to say almost always, that when we go into a room and we eyeball the people in the room, are we prone to judging how they look, how they appear, what they're wearing, their actions, and their body movements? I think we are. And so I think we've become a generation that is very quick to judge. When you see the speck in your brother's eye, but the log that is in your eye, do you not notice? In other words, we need to look first and examine ourselves before we start examining someone else. Verse 4, how can you say to your brother, permit me, and I will remove the speck from your eye when the log is in your own eye? I love that. Verse 5, hypocrite, remove first the log from your eye, and afterward you will see to remove the speck from the eye of your brother. And this is, to me, one of my favorite examples of Yeshua's humor. I mean, the apostles, the disciples, the listeners at that time had to be cracking up.
Did you know that the book of Matthew was originally written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus? You know, there comes a time in a person's life when you want to know what you believe and why you believe it, when you have to stop the madness of the modern world and go back to where you first believed. You can do that with Israel TV Network. For the first time in over 2,000 years, a line-by-line commentary on the Aramaic original book of Matthew has been created by Dr. Rik Wadge. You can learn along by watching Israel TV Network, discovering the Jewish roots. You can own this piece of history by going to Amazon.com and ordering Discovering the Jewish Roots of the Book of Matthew. Stop the world, enhance your mind with the unchanging Word of God today.
the speck and the plank. Here he goes, Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua. He's going to tell the story again. Rabbi Yeshua, tell us the story about the speck and the plank again. They were laughing. This is classic Yeshua, classic Jesus. They were definitely getting the jokes and the puns. And once again, this reflects, though, an older Jewish saying, and many of the sayings that had come down through the ages that were proverbs by the time that Jesus, Yeshua, was growing up. Little Yeshi was growing up. For example, let me give you this one that's oral tradition passed down into the Talmud. And it says this: Rabbi Tafan said, I wonder whether there is any in this generation that will receive reproof. If one should say to him, cast out the mote of thine eye, will he say to him, cast out the beam out of thine eye? Says Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, I wonder whether there is any in this generation that knows how to reprove. That is almost identical to the sayings of Yeshua. And some would say, and I've heard it said, well, these are all copies of the original words of Yeshua. 2 points that I would disagree with. Number one, I would say, again, it is not said that Yeshua came up with some brand new type of teaching. It is not said that. Secondarily, if the rabbis were so, and they were, most of them were so against the followers of Yeshua, this messianic Jewish movement that was beginning because they were refusing to fight in some of the battles, revolting against Rome. And so they didn't even allow Yeshua's words to be in the Mishnah. So if that's the case, and it is the case, then why in the world would we even imagine for a moment that they would copy and repeat Yeshua's words? See, it doesn't make any sense at all. At least not to me, it doesn't make any sense. Well, let me give you some more words from the wise rabbis regarding this same topic. He who condemns others sees in them his own faults. Babylonian Talmud, Kedoshim 70a. Here's another one from Bava Meziah from 59a, and it says, do not rebuke your fellow with your own blemish. That is such a popular idea and something that is repeated over and over again within the words of the Talmud. And I'll give you a story from Bava Batra 60b. It's a little lengthy, but I think it's worth repeating. And it goes like this. So Rabbi Yanai had a tree, the branches of which linked over the public way, and another man had a similar tree. Then the people came to the other man and told him to remove it, and he came to Rabbi Yanai, who said to him, go away now, but come again tomorrow. Now during the night, the rabbi had his own tree cut down. When the man came again, Rabbi Yanai said, cut down your tree. Then the man said, well, you have a similar tree. And then Rabbi Yanai said, go and look. My tree is not cut down, and do not cut yours down. Here's the question. Why did Rabbi Yanai change his mind? Before he thought the people liked the tree because they could sit in its shade. But when he found that they disliked the trees, he cut his tree down. Why did he not say to the man, you cut yours down, then I will cut mine down? And here's the gist and the lesson of the story. Because of a teaching of Resh Lakish, who said, first clean yourself and then clean others. So this is the point. Get your act together first before you start telling somebody else to get their act together. So you get the idea in this. You can't give what you don't live. And that's just so true. I know it sounds trite and it's a little cute because it rhymes, but it's true. We cannot give what we do not live. And I'll give you another one that rhymes as well, and that would be, we hate to wait. And it's really true. We forget that it takes time to learn and to implant something into our lives that changes our character and the way we live. And so for us to expect someone else to have done that, and maybe they didn't even know, maybe they hadn't even started the journey on that part of their character, and that's wrong of us. You know, we don't do that to ourselves usually, so we shouldn't do that to others. So we need to implant these ideas and these characteristics in our own life first before we expect that to be a part of somebody else's. But this passage also has another example which shows Yeshua's vast knowledge of his culture. Through the Sermon on the Mount, we've come to see that our rabbi was extremely knowledgeable about many things. One would be Jewish law. Absolutely, he knew the Torah. He knew the prophets. It's amazing. He quotes from the Torah all the time. He quotes from the prophets all the time. But also, not just that, not just from the Tanakh, he also knew the teachings of the Sanhedrin. He quotes them repeatedly. And not just that, but the writings of the Essenes also. And you can't see it on the screen right now, but this Jewish sect at the Dead Sea, Qumran, Yeshua, to me, looks at them, gives them as an example of humility at one point in time in the Sermon on the Mount, but also quotes some of them. And I think Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, did the same thing. And maybe he was a part of that community. We just don't know for sure. But another one, and you can't see it right there on the screen, but he also knew Jewish folklore and the sayings of the day. And I think that is just so vital. Now what I want to do is we're going to be going through and really in the next couple of sessions together, we're going to be finishing up the Sermon on the Mount and that section from Matthew 5 through Matthew 7. We're gonna finish that off as we continue through Matthew. But to me, the Sermon on the Mount is just this pinnacle of the teaching of Yeshua. So I want to continue now. I want to recap Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 1 and going to verse 5. It says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For with the judgment that you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure that you use to measure, it will be measured to you. Why is it that you see the speck in the eye of your brother, but the log that is in your eye you do not notice? How can you say to your brother, 'Permit me, and I will remove the speck from your eye,' when the log is in your eye? Hypocrite, remove first the log from your eye, and afterward you will surely see to remove the speck from the eye of your brother." Now, we examined this in the first part of this session together, but I want you also to notice Yeshua's stance upon pronouncing judgment upon another, and that it was wrong, and it was also in agreement with the common teachings of the day by the other rabbis, the oral traditions that would later on go into the writings of the Talmud. We could summarize this as saying, in the way that you pronounce judgment upon others, that will be the pronouncement of judgment that God uses to judge you. So, he's saying, be forgiving and understanding toward one another. Because we're all going to be judged by God in the end, and his judgment is fairer, clearer, and more righteous than ours could ever be. And it will be completely fair. So when we judge, we have a stigma. We have a log in our eye. God does not. And I think that's a good way of summarizing this section. So Yeshua continues then with the same topic of judging, in other words, of seeing something offensive in a person's life, and now he takes it to the next logical lesson. Remember, we've said this all along, that there's logic that goes from point A to point B to point C to point D, etc., throughout the Sermon on the Mount. They're not just random ethical teachings, but they follow a train of thought. One leads to the next. So now he's going to teach about offering advice to a person who's in need of instruction. In other words, he's saying, don't be critical, don't inappropriately judge, but what about helpful advice? And now he's going to discuss this in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 6. "Do not give the kodesh to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before the pigs, or else they will trample them with their feet and then turn and tear you apart," he says. Okay, so the kodesh, or the things that are holy, kodesh or kadosh, we would say, they're like terms that come from the same root, are the pearls, the things of value. They're the items of concern here. They're sacred things, they're costly things, the things that are important to God and the things that are of importance to us. The holy, the pearls. I get it. I understand this. So don't just go offering these really important things around you to the people who will not appreciate them, is what he's saying. The topic, remember, is one of giving of advice. And our rabbi says that those people will trample them under their feet. In other words, they will consider anything but kadosh, what you're saying, anything but holy. Instead of seeing them of value, they will devalue them and they will tear you apart. In other words, they're going to rip you apart for what you're saying and saying how ridiculous you are. And it could even go further than that. You could be so offending them with the things of holiness when they're being unholy with their lives that they create bodily harm for you and others. But whom is the Lord talking about? Is he actually telling them who to watch out for? And the answer is yes. It's found in the idioms of the day. In first century Judaism, a dog used in this lesson by Rabbi Yeshua was a non-Jew. And a pig was a known idiom in the first century Judaism for, more specifically, for a Roman. So a dog was a non-Jew, a pig was a Roman. In effect, the Lord is saying, don't be surprised. Friends, don't be surprised if non-Jews or even the Romans more specifically don't appreciate the holy things of God or the values that you have based your life upon, or that they respond by belittling you and belittling the advice and hurting you in the process. Don't be surprised. And there's some similar advice as we're finishing up this session, and it's found within the Talmud, and it says this: Rabbi Levi said, God made Israel swear that they should not reveal the Messianic age or the Messianic end, depending on the translation, and should not reveal the secrets of the Torah to the idolaters. That is to say, that things pertaining to the Messiah are of the greatest of importance, and people who are disrespecting God, idolaters in other words, shouldn't be allowed to disrespect the Messiah as well. See, the utmost respect we're to have for the Messiah. So he's saying, and they are saying, the rabbis of the day, so keep them out of the conversation, the dogs and the pigs. Keep them out of the conversation. They'll just see it as being unimportant anyways, and they'll disrespect the Messianic kingdom, the things to come, the things of God, the holiness, and how God tells us to live, and why you're living the way you're. They just won't get it. So keep them out of the conversation. And so it's very interesting that Rabbi Yeshua uses these same rabbinic terms for non-Jews and Romans as was used by the other rabbis of the time. We're going to talk more about this in our next session together. But friends, more than anything, I want you to understand that God has a plan for our lives. And whether you're Jewish or you're non-Jewish, God has brought these two together. He has grafted the non-Jews that are followers of the Messiah, and hopefully getting the understanding that the instructions of the Torah are not done away with. They're a part of our lives as well. We need to follow them, and that's what Rabbi Yeshua is teaching all the way through his instructions, because his instructions come from God. His instructions are of God. His instructions are also blended in with the Torah, because the Torah is the source of the instructions from God. And so we're to apply those to our lives, graft in with the Jewish people, and follow after the words of our Rabbi Yeshua. Well, friends, until next time, may the God of heaven and earth be with you. May you understand that He is the source of life, and may you find fullness of life in Him. Until next time, shalom, shalom.